The story behind the headlines. In cooperation with the American Historical Association, we again present Caesar Searchinger, noted foreign correspondent and writer, in an informal analysis of the news. Mr. Searchinger retraces the events of the past to help you in arriving at a fuller understanding of what is happening today. Tonight, Mr. Searchinger's subject is New Zealand as our partner in Pacific defense. Caesar Searchinger.
Good evening. The agitation for a Pacific War Council with headquarters in Washington has reached a new stage. The question was first raised by the Australian government some time ago when Prime Minister Curtin said that Australia looked to the United States for leadership in the Pacific War. Another phase of this Pacific defense problem was Australia's demand for representation in an Imperial War Cabinet in London, which has now reached its sequel in the appointment of Richard G. Casey, Australian Minister in Washington, to the British War Cabinet as Minister of State. Since last weekend, there have been discussions at the White House with Dr. Herbert Everett,
the Australian Minister of External Affairs, who's now on a special mission to this country, and with Walter Nash, the recently appointed New Zealand Minister in Washington. President Roosevelt afterwards spoke of the teamwork and contact between the three countries, meaning Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. By the end of the week, it seemed that the creation of a Pacific War Council was on the verge of formation, pending, of course, the expected concurrence of the British government. Behind these recent moves is the changed condition in the Pacific area. The old ABCD command, Australian, British, Chinese, Dutch, has, as the President put it, gone out of business with the fall of the Netherlands Indies. What forces the Dutch have left are merged with those of Australia. China is collaborating closely with the British forces in Burma, and its function in the Pacific area is now confined to its internal defense. British naval and land forces are fully occupied in other theaters of war, and General Wavell's headquarters have been moved to India. The Pacific area is therefore completely in the hands of the Pacific countries, Australia, New Zealand, and the USA. The arrival of General MacArthur in Australia and the recent activities of the Japanese in that area have focused our attention on that continent. But New Zealand is an equally vital factor in the strategy of the United Nations, so I'm going to say a few things about that. It is no less necessary to hold New Zealand as Australia itself. For if the Japanese were to land in New Zealand, they would be able to cut our communications with Australia, and they could outflank any offensive which we might launch against Japan. In such an offensive, New Zealand may become a secondary base of operations. Even now, Auckland and Wellington are chief termini of our trans-Pacific supply lines. And New Zealand is, of course, an essential supply base, especially as regards that most vital material of war, namely food. With its extensive farming, stock-raising, and dairying industries, it is capable of supplying not only its own forces, but those in Australia, if the need should arise. But it is clear that an island nation with less than 1.75 million inhabitants cannot defend itself against invasion without outside aid. New Zealand has a standing army of about 30,000 men, plus a considerable home guard. When conscription was introduced in the summer of 1940, 80,000 New Zealanders had already volunteered for service overseas, 4,000 of them Maoris, the original New Zealand natives. By November, 20,000 of them were abroad, including a Maori battalion which earned undying fame in the defense of Crete. I shall tell you more about the Maoris later on. The number of men enlisted to date, Prime Minister Peter Fraser told an NBC audience last Monday, is equivalent to what a force of 11 million would be in the United States. However, in a nation of 1.7 million, that is less than 150,000. So while many New Zealanders are still fighting in other theaters of war, American soldiers are being sent to reinforce the defenders of New Zealand itself. That is a good thing in more ways than one. For in this way, a number of Americans are going to become acquainted with one of the most beautiful, salubrious, and socially advanced countries in the world, and one which embodies many of the best features of our own in miniature. The size of New Zealand is somewhat less than New England plus New York State. It consists of two rather narrow islands, North Island and South Island, stretching for about 1,000 miles from northeast to southwest. They are approximately as far south of the equator as our Pacific coast is north of it. So in climate, you get something like Seattle at one end and something like Los Angeles at the other. In other words, ideal. The scenery of the country is spectacular, from steep, snow-covered mountain ranges of over 10,000 feet, glaciers descend to within a quarter of a mile of the sea, in some places through the dense evergreen of a subtropical forest. It's a paradise for the big game fisherman and the mountain climber. Some parts of New Zealand have reminded people of Japan, and there is even a close rival to Fujiyama, the snow-capped cone of Mount Egmont. Yet there is much of the homely atmosphere characteristic of fertile, temperate countries that appeals to the romantic European. In this, as in other respects, New Zealand is very different from its nearest neighbor, Australia, about 1,300 miles away, which is a continent the size of the United States, a place of wide open spaces and much of it arid. But the contrasts go deeper than geography. Australia has long had a vigorous nationalism of its own. New Zealand still preserves a strong sentimental attachment for England. Even third-generation New Zealanders who have never been outside the country continue to speak of England as home. Australia, in spite of its enormous sheep-raising industry, has become considerably industrialized in the last 2 decades. New Zealand still remains predominantly a country of farms and pastures. It has, in fact, been described as a kind of outlying dairy farm for Great Britain. There are also important historical and political differences between Australia and New Zealand. Australia has adopted a federal constitution based in many respects on our own. Consequently, it has 6 state governments as well as a federal government. New Zealand, though it formerly had provincial governments, abolished them and set up a single unitary government for the whole country. In other respects, however, their political institutions are similar. Both are self-governing dominions with a prime minister and a cabinet responsible to Parliament. The British King is represented by a Governor-General whose functions are purely formal. The story of New Zealand's settlement is practically unique. It was the result of an idealist's dream. In the early years of the 19th century, one Edward Gibbon Wakefield had a vision of solving England's social economic problems by systematic overseas colonization. His idea was to transplant a replica of English society from the country squire and the urban capitalist to the farmhand, artisan, and clerk to somewhere overseas. The enterprise was to be financed from the sale of land duly acquired from the natives. Christian benevolence and social enlightenment were to do the rest. After a preliminary experiment in South Australia, Wakefield's eye lighted on New Zealand, which Cook had once tried to annex for King George III. But the British government, still remembering all the trouble with the North American colonies, wasn't any more helpful to Wakefield than it had been to Captain Cook. Until, in 1840, a rival French settlement company was threatening to get ahead of the British. Thereupon, Queen Victoria's ministers gave their blessing and signed a treaty with the native Maori chiefs, which transferred sovereignty to the British Crown. The Maoris had already been affected by Christianity, and it was their trust in the Christian missionaries that induced them to sign. Wakefield's dream to transplant a cross-section of English society didn't altogether come true, but his careful organization of the colonists has left a permanent mark. It facilitated the orderly settlement of the uncultivated land of the country. In consequence, New Zealand has always been much more a country of small individual farmers, in contrast to the vast sheep and cattle ranches of Australia, in the early days at least. And the inspiration of Wakefield, the reformer, lives on today in the outstandingly progressive social legislation in which New Zealand has been a pioneer. It may be said to have had its New Deal about 50 years ago. In the 1890s, New Zealand's government established such things as old age pensions and widows' pensions, family allowances, government loans to homeowners, government-operated insurance companies, etc. Women's suffrage was adopted in New Zealand many years before here. And recently, under the Labour government, which came into power in 1935, there have been other important measures of social welfare, including the establishment of an all-embracing system of social security, including unemployment, health and old age, and medical care. As the result of its infant welfare program, New Zealand has the lowest rate of infant mortality in the world. Wealth in New Zealand is better distributed than in most countries. Real incomes of the lower middle classes, that is, incomes in terms of purchasing power, are on the average higher than those of corresponding groups in America. New Zealand is the youngest white man's country in the world. Up to 1840, it was inhabited not by primitive aborigines like Australia, but by a relatively cultured and decidedly warlike branch of the Polynesian race, the Maori. The Maoris migrated to New Zealand from somewhere in the Central Pacific from 500 to 600 years ago, in canoes, mind you, an incredible feat of seamanship. For centuries they managed to resist white settlement, except for some missionaries in the north, although the islands had been discovered by the Dutch navigator Tasman as far back as 1642. Although the white man did not settle in New Zealand till 200 years later, his treatment of the Maori was only somewhat better than his treatment of the American Indian over here. It was the same old story of thousands of acres of valuable land turned over to the white settlers for a few guns or blankets, though eventually the New Zealand government set up a land court to protect the Maori's remaining heritage. It was largely because of disputes over land that various Maori tribes embarked on fierce wars against the settlers in the 1860s. They fought with great skill and bravery. In one case, when the Maoris were surrounded and called upon to surrender, they sent out an envoy with a message which has since then become the motto of a New Zealand regiment: Ake ake kia ka. We will fight on forever and ever. On one occasion, having taken the Christian teachings seriously, they actually stopped fighting on Sunday, and they felt bitterly betrayed when the British troops took advantage of this to launch an attack. In the days of fighting, the Maori warrior earned the respect and admiration of the British soldier. Today, every New Zealander has a genuine fondness for the Maori citizen. To have Maori blood in your veins is a distinction. After a period of decline, the Maoris have found their feet in the new order of things. Their numbers are increasing, and they share in the possession of the land and the nation's prosperity. Maoris sit in Parliament. Some have risen to cabinet rank. The Maori soldier is as famous for his valor today as his forefather was. He has served the British Empire in the last war, and he is fighting for his country's democracy today. For there is no doubt in anybody's mind that New Zealand deserves the name of democracy as much as any country on earth, and the responsibility for defending it must naturally be shared by us. It is true that we in this country haven't been very conscious of this younger sister democracy across the seas. In peacetime, international relations are apt to be based very largely on trade, on export and import trade. And while we have sold 5 times as much to New Zealand as she has sold to us, a country of 1.7 million can absorb only just so much. Not till 2 months ago did the two countries think it worthwhile to exchange diplomatic envoys. But the eminence of these two men indicates how important these relations have suddenly become. New Zealand has sent us Peter Nash, the intellectual leader of the Labour Party, and until recently the dominating figure in the cabinet. We have sent no less a person than Patrick J. Hurley, former Secretary of War. It's clear that New Zealand's importance in the world struggle cannot be measured by her size alone. If we are to have a Pacific Council, War Council, New Zealand is as indispensable in it as Australia and the United States. And when we consider the principles involved in this war, New Zealand stands out as a shining example of all the things we are fighting for: genuine dynamic democracy and the freedom of man. Good night.
You've been listening to Caesar Searchinger, whom we presented in cooperation with the American Historical Association. Next Sunday evening, Caesar Searchinger will be back with another story behind the headlines.